The final song began not with sound but with silence so profound that it seemed to pause the universe itself. Every transformed being across the galaxy drew in breath simultaneously, their consciousness merging into a single entity that spanned star systems and transcended the boundaries between species. Emma stood between Kira and Nyx, her small hands touching their scaled foreheads as she became the focal point for communication that was about to reshape everything. Her human mind, with its unique capacity for empathy and adaptation, served as the bridge that allowed alien consciousness to touch alien consciousness in perfect harmony. "I can see them," she whispered, her eyes closed but her awareness expanding beyond the physical, the people on the ships with the dampeners. "They're so scared. They think we're going to take away everything that makes them who they are." Through the network, Zixthara felt what his daughter was experiencing. The crew members of the hegemony vessels weren't monsters or fanatics. They were beings terrified of losing their identity in a galaxy that seemed to be changing too fast for them to understand. Their consciousness dampeners weren't just blocking empathic communication. They were blocking the very possibility of growth and change. "Show them," Kira said, her voice now speaking for billions of connected minds across the galaxy. "Show them that we're not here to take anything away. We're here to give them more of what they already are." The song that erupted from the network was beyond sound, beyond music, beyond any form of communication that had ever existed. It was pure meaning transmitted directly from consciousness to consciousness, carrying with it every memory, every hope, every dream of every transformed being who had ever felt lost or broken or unwanted. The consciousness dampeners on the hegemony vessels, designed to block empathic intrusion, had never been tested against anything like this. They began to overload as the sheer volume of genuine emotion and connection overwhelmed their circuits. One by one they failed, leaving their crews suddenly vulnerable to the full force of the galactic network's compassion. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. A hegemony weapons officer who had spent his life believing that genetic purity was the highest virtue suddenly experienced what it felt like to be a defective child discovering that their differences were actually gifts. A ship's engineer who had been taught that other species were inferior threats felt the joy of the Zarathi children as they used their blindness to navigate impossible asteroid fields. A commander who had built his identity around the superiority of his race experienced the profound loneliness that Zixthara had carried for months, believing his children were broken. But most importantly, they all felt Emma's perspective, the view of a human child who had never seen differences as defects, who had approached alien beings with curiosity instead of fear, who had instinctively understood that helping others grow was the highest calling any being could have. The three hegemony vessels powered down their weapons as their crews experienced the most profound paradigm shift in galactic history. Some were weeping. Others were laughing with the joy of sudden understanding. All of them were changed. "This is Captain Mordak of the Pure Vision to all vessels," came a transmission from the lead hegemony ship. "Cease all hostilities immediately. We need to understand what we've been fighting against." "You haven't been fighting against us," Emma said softly, her voice somehow carrying across all communication channels simultaneously. "You've been fighting against a part of yourselves that you didn't know existed yet. The battle ended not with surrender or defeat, but with revelation." Ship after ship sent requests for permission to dock, their crews desperate to see in person what they had experienced through the network. Within hours, the research station was hosting the largest interspecies gathering in recorded history. Dr. Vex High moved through the crowds with wonder, documenting everything as beings from dozens of worlds met, transformed individuals from their own species for the first time. The reactions were universally the same. Initial shock giving way to recognition, then to acceptance, and finally to celebration as they understood what their defective members had actually become. "The preliminary readings are extraordinary," Vex High reported to the growing council of species representatives. "We're seeing spontaneous genetic activation events throughout the assembled fleets. The proximity to highly developed network members is triggering dormant sequences in individuals who showed no previous signs of variant genetics. Evolution is contagious," Sarah observed with scientific fascination. "The more beings are exposed to this level of interspecies cooperation and acceptance, the more likely they are to develop the enhanced empathic and communication abilities themselves." Captain Mordak, a massive hegemony warrior whose genetically perfect physiology had never shown any variant traits, approached with news that would have been impossible to believe just days earlier. "My youngest offspring," he said, his voice filled with wonder rather than the shame such an admission would have carried in the past. "She's beginning to show the signs. Her scales are losing their traditional coloration, and she started making those harmonious sounds that the transformed ones use for communication." "How do you feel about that?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possessed. Mordak knelt down to her level, his massive frame dwarfing the small human girl who had inadvertently changed the course of galactic civilization. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also hopeful. For the first time in my life, hopeful that my daughter might become something greater than I ever imagined possible." 3 months later, the research station had been expanded into a full university complex, with campuses on 47 different worlds. The Metamorphosis Academy, as it came to be known, specialized in helping beings discover and develop their unique potential, rather than forcing them to conform to species norms. Zixthera stood in the original hydroponics bay, now preserved as a memorial to the moment when everything changed. His offspring had grown remarkably, their abilities expanding as they matured. They could now facilitate communication between any species in the galaxy, serve as living bridges between worlds that had never been able to understand each other before. "Daddy," Kira approached with the gliding movement that had become natural to her kind. "The Earth delegation is here. They want to talk about establishing a permanent embassy for interspecies cooperation." "And the Velthari Council?" Zixthera asked. "They're requesting permission to study our development techniques," Nyx replied with amusement. "They want to learn how to identify and nurture variant genetics instead of eliminating them." Emma, now a year older and serving as the unofficial ambassador between human space and the galactic community, bounded up with her characteristic energy. "The best part is the new song the network composed. It's specifically designed to help scared people understand that change doesn't mean losing who they are. It means becoming who they were always meant to be." As if summoned by her words, the universal song began again, carried by millions of voices across thousands of worlds. But this time it wasn't a cry for help or a desperate attempt to prevent war. It was a celebration of diversity, a hymn to the possibility that existed when different beings chose to grow together instead of apart. "What started all this?" Zixthera mused, watching the bustling activity around them as beings from across the galaxy worked together on projects that would have been impossible before the transformation. "What made the difference?" Sarah appeared beside them, her hair now streaked with silver but her eyes still bright with curiosity and wonder. "A human child who saw potential instead of problems. A father who chose to trust his offspring instead of his prejudices. And the simple radical idea that being different isn't something to be cured, it's something to be celebrated." Emma grinned, the expression lighting up her face with the joy that had become infectious throughout the galaxy. "Plus, humans are really good at making friends. We just taught everyone else how to do it too." As the sun set over the Academy complex, casting long shadows through the original garden where it all began, the song continued. It was picked up by ships traveling between worlds, by children playing in schoolyards, by beings who had never imagined they could communicate with anyone outside their own species, though Galaxy had learned the most important lesson humanity had to offer, that love and acceptance weren't weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths that could transform the very nature of existence itself. And it had all started with 2 albino hatchlings and a human girl who believed that everyone deserved to become who they were truly meant to be. The age of separation was over. The age of connection had begun. And somewhere in the vast network that now spanned the galaxy, new voices were beginning to sing, ready to discover what wonders they might achieve when they were finally free to be themselves. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday, which Emma later said was particularly rude because Tuesdays were supposed to be peaceful days for learning new songs. The traditional Unity Coalition had chosen their moment carefully. Most of the adult researchers were in deep sleep cycle, and the security protocols had been relaxed due to the recent period of galactic goodwill. Zixthera woke to the sound of his offspring singing, but this wasn't their usual harmonious melody. This was a warning song, complex and urgent, carrying layers of meaning that cut through his consciousness like a blade. Danger was coming, fast, multiple sources, hostile intent. He reached the observation deck just as the first wave of Coalition ships dropped out of hyperspace. 12 massive vessels, each one representing a different species united in their determination to cleanse the galaxy of genetic contamination. The irony that such diversity was being used to oppose diversity itself was not lost on him. How long until they reach us? He asked Thorn, who was already at the defense console despite being roused from sleep only moments earlier. 18 minutes, the Chromax replied grimly. Our shields will hold for maybe 5 minutes against that kind of firepower. The station wasn't designed for military engagement. Sarah arrived with Emma close behind, both of them showing the controlled panic that came from understanding exactly how much danger they were in. The children? All accounted for and moving to the protected sectors, Thorn reported, though the transformed ones are insisting they can help with the defense. Absolutely not, Zixathera said firmly. They're children, enhanced or not. This is not their fight. Emma tugged on his arm with the persistent urgency that only human children could muster. Mr. Zixathera, you're not listening. They're not asking to fight. They're asking to talk. Before he could ask what she meant, the main communication system activated without anyone touching the controls. Kira and Nyx appeared on the primary screen, but they weren't alone. The display split and subdivided, showing dozens of other transformed beings from across the galaxy, all connected in real time despite the vast distances between them. Father, Kira's voice resonated through the station's speakers with harmonics that seemed to calm everyone who heard them. We know what the Coalition wants. We can feel their fear and anger, but we can also feel something else. Confusion, Nyx added, her scales shifting through patterns that seemed to translate emotions into visible form. Many of them don't really understand what they're fighting against. They only know what they've been told. One of the Zarathi younglings spoke from a facility 3-star systems away. The commanders are afraid, but most of the crews are just following orders. If we can show them the truth. You're talking about attempting to communicate with a hostile military force, Vexai interrupted, having arrived with a team of scientists. The risk is enormous. If you fail, if they interpret your contact as an attack, if we don't try, people are going to die, Emma said with the stark honesty that made adult arguments seem petty and small. And if people die because we were too scared to talk to them, then what's the point of everything we've learned? The Coalition fleet was now visible to the naked eye, their ships arranged in a formation designed to maximize intimidation. Zixathera knew that in a few minutes those vessels would open fire, and everything they had built would be reduced to debris and memory. Do it, he said quietly. Zixathera, the risk, Vexai began. The risk of not trying is greater, Zixathera cut him off. If my children believe they can reach them, then I believe in my children. The network of transformed beings began to sing, but this was unlike anything they had attempted before. Instead of the gentle harmonies that had characterized their previous communications, this was a song of such power and complexity that it seemed to bend reality around it. The station's hull began to resonate, and for a moment Zixathera worried that the vibrations might tear the structure apart. Then the song reached the Coalition fleet, the lead vessels. Forward momentum faltered as the communication pierced through their shields and directly into the consciousness of every being aboard. Unlike the gentle introductions the transformed beings usually offered, this was a full immersion experience. Every crew member suddenly found themselves experiencing the galaxy from the perspective of someone they had been taught to see as a monster. Velthari Gunner felt what it was like to be Kira, growing up knowing that her own people would rather see her dead than different. A human weapons officer experienced Nyx's joy at discovering that her unique abilities could help plants grow in impossible conditions. A Zarathi navigator suddenly understood what the transformed Zarathi children had seen when they looked at star charts. Not empty space between points of light, but connections, relationships, a vast web of gravitational poetry that most beings never noticed. The effect was immediate and profound. One by one, the Coalition ships powered down their weapon systems. The commanders were screaming orders that their crews were no longer willing to follow. Some vessels began to pull back from attack formation. Others moved closer, their crews desperate to understand more about what they had just experienced. It's working, Sarah breathed, watching the tactical display show the dissolution of the Coalition's attack formation. But not all of the ships were affected equally. 3 vessels, crewed entirely by members of the hegemony of pure genetics, had been fitted with consciousness dampeners specifically designed to block empathic communication. Their commanders had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. "Incoming fire!" Thorn shouted as energy beams lanced out from the 3 remaining hostile vessels. The station's shields flared and held, but the power drain was enormous. They could withstand perhaps 2 more volleys before the defensive systems failed completely. "The rest of the fleet," Emma said urgently, watching the other coalition vessels. "They're trying to protect us." It was true. The ships that had been touched by the transformed being's communication were now positioning themselves between the station and the 3 attacking vessels. What had begun as a unified assault force was rapidly becoming a 3-way conflict as former allies turned on each other. "This is Commander Vexhai of the research station to all coalition vessels," Vexhai announced over the emergency frequency. "What you've experienced is real. We're not trying to replace your species or contaminate your genetics. We're offering you the chance to become more than you ever imagined possible." "Lies," the response came from the lead hegemony vessel. "You've infected them with your alien mind control. This is exactly why the contamination must be stopped." More energy beams struck the station, but now they were absorbed by the shields of 3 coalition vessels that had moved to intercept. The battle was no longer between the station and the fleet. It was between 2 different visions of the galaxy's future. "We have to stop this," Emma said desperately. "People are fighting because of us. This isn't what we wanted." Kira and Nyx appeared beside their human friend, having left the protected areas despite all orders to the contrary. Their scales were shifting through rapid color patterns that Zixathera recognized as intense emotional processing. "We can reach the ones with the dampeners," Kira said, "but we'll have to get much closer. And we'll have to link with everyone in the network at the same time." "That's never been attempted," Vexhai warned. "The neural stress could be fatal. So could letting this war spread through the galaxy," Nyx replied calmly. "We know the risks, Dr. Vexhai, but we also know what happens if we do nothing." Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, her expression serious. "Sweetheart, if they try this and something goes wrong, then we'll figure out how to fix it," Emma replied with the unshakable confidence that had started this entire revolution. "We always do." The battle raged around them as the 3 young beings prepared to attempt something that could either save the galaxy or destroy them all. In the end, it came down to the same choice that had started everything. The choice to trust in the power of connection over the safety of isolation. "Begin the link," Zixathera ordered, his voice steady despite his terror. "Show them who we really are." 3 months after the first Universal song, the research station had become the unofficial headquarters of what galactic media was calling the Metamorphosis Movement. Ships arrived daily, carrying beings that their homeworlds had given up on. The blind Zerathi, whose heightened spatial awareness could navigate asteroid fields better than any computer. The mute Zephyrians, whose telepathic abilities had been dismissed as fantasy. The stunted Kronax, whose size made them perfect for delicate engineering work that their massive species couldn't perform. Emma had become something of a celebrity, though she seemed entirely unaware of her fame. She moved through the expanding complex with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted that differences were meant to be celebrated. Her ability to communicate with the transformed beings had evolved along with theirs, creating a feedback loop of understanding that amazed scientists throughout the galaxy. "The morning reports," Sarah announced, entering the main observation deck where Zixathera now spent most of his time coordinating with other worlds. 17 new facilities have opened this week alone. The Velthari Council has officially rescinded the albino elimination protocols, and the Chromax Collective is requesting assistance in establishing their own garden project. Zixathera's throat sacs pulsed with satisfaction. "And the resistance movements?" "Growing more vocal but losing support," Thorn reported from his position at the security station. "The Traditional Unity Coalition is planning another protest, but their membership has dropped by 60% since the Betelgeuse incident." The Betelgeuse incident had become legendary throughout the galaxy. A supposedly defective Rigelian child with oversized cranial lobes had single-handedly solved a critical oxygen shortage that had threatened an entire star system. The solution had been elegant, innovative, and completely beyond the capabilities of traditional Rigelian engineering. After that, it became harder to argue that different meant inferior. Dr. Vexhai approached with his daily briefing. His entire demeanor transformed from the rigid scientist who had first visited the station. His work documenting the genetic triggers for metamorphosis had revolutionized xenobiology. But more importantly, it had given hope to millions of beings who had lived their lives believing they were broken. The latest batch of DNA analysis shows the pattern is accelerating, he reported. We're not just seeing activation in individuals with known genetic variations. We're seeing spontaneous mutations that seem designed to enhance interspecies communication and cooperation. Evolution in real time, Sarah mused, as if the galaxy itself is responding to the new social environment we're creating. Emma looked up from where she was, teaching a group of young beings from 5 different species how to harmonize their natural communication methods. Maybe it is responding. Maybe the galaxy got tired of waiting for everyone to figure out how to be friends. Her simple observation sent a chill through the adults present. The implications were staggering. That consciousness itself might be a force for evolutionary change. So the very act of acceptance and cooperation could trigger biological adaptations that enhance those qualities. The Philosophical Council has requested a formal audience, Vexhai continued. They want to discuss the theological implications of conscious evolution. Let them discuss, Zixthera said dismissively. While they debate whether we're witnessing divine intervention or cosmic accident, the children are busy creating the future. As if summoned by his words, Kira and Nyx appeared alongside their human friend, but they weren't alone. A small parade of transformed beings followed them, each one physically different from their original species, each one radiating the same sense of purpose and connection that had become the hallmark of the metamorphosis. Daddy? Kira spoke aloud, her voice carrying harmonics that made the word resonate with emotional depth. Her verbal communication had developed remarkably, though she still preferred the empathic connections that allowed for more complete understanding. We need to show you something important. The group led them to the newest section of the complex, a vast chamber that had been designed as a meeting space for interspecies conferences. But the transformed beings had converted it into something entirely different. A living map of the galaxy created from bioluminescent organisms, quantum holographic projectors, and what appeared to be pure thought made visible. We've been talking to our friends on other worlds, Nyx explained, her white scales shimmering with patterns that seemed to mirror the stellar formations displayed around them. All of us who have changed. We can feel each other across the galaxy now, like points of light in a vast network. Emma gestured to specific areas of the living map where the light was brightest. They're showing us where the most changes are happening. It's not random. There's a pattern. Sarah was already pulling out her scanners, her scientific training overriding her amazement. What kind of pattern? Connection points, one of the other transformed beings replied. This was a young Zarathi, whose blindness had revealed an ability to perceive electromagnetic fields across vast distances. Places where different species meet and interact. The more cooperation that exists, the more likely the metamorphosis becomes. You're saying that social harmony triggers biological evolution? Vexhai asked, his voice barely containing his excitement. We're saying that evolution was always supposed to work this way, Kira replied. But most species got so focused on competing with each other that they forgot how to grow together. Thorne's gravelly voice cut through the wonder with practical concerns. If you can communicate across the galaxy, what about species that don't want to change? What about the ones who see this as a threat to their traditional way of life? The transformed beings exchanged glances that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Finally, Emma spoke for all of them, her young voice carrying the weight of cosmic understanding. We've already talked to them too, the angry ones, the scared ones, the ones who think we're going to take over or replace them. Her expression grew sad but determined. Most of them are just afraid because they don't understand. But some of them see us as a disease to be cured, Nyx finished quietly. They're organizing, planning to stop the metamorphosis by any means necessary. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They had created something beautiful and unprecedented, but they had also created something that threatened the established order of galactic civilization. There would be consequences. How long do we have? Zixthera asked. 3 standard months, the Zarathi replied. Maybe less. The traditional Unity Coalition has allied with the hegemony of pure genetics and the Species Separation Alliance. They're calling it Operation Restoration. Sarah closed her eyes, processing the threat to everything they had built. When she opened them again, her expression was fierce with determination. Then we have 3 months to show the galaxy that what we've created isn't a threat to their future. It is their future. Emma, how many worlds are part of the network now? All of them, Emma replied simply. Even the ones that don't know it yet. The connection is everywhere now. It just needs the right conditions to wake up. Then let's wake it up, Zixthara said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had found his purpose. Let's show them what the galaxy looks like when every being is free to become what they were truly meant to be. The living map around them pulsed with renewed light, as if responding to their determination. Across the galaxy, in facilities and hidden gardens, in secret laboratories and open schools, the transformed beings felt the pulse and began to sing their universal song once more. The real test was about to begin. Word of the transformed hatchlings spread through the station, faster than Zixthara had anticipated. Within a week, representatives from a dozen different species had requested permission to observe what the humans were calling the Garden Project. The name itself revealed something fundamental. About human thinking, they saw this as cultivation, not experimentation. Dr. Vexhai, a prominent Velthari geneticist, arrived on the next transport with a team of specialists. Zixthara had known Vexhai since their academy days, and he braced himself for the inevitable criticism. Traditional Velthari science did not accommodate unexplained phenomena, especially ones involving genetic aberrations. Zixthara, Vexhai greeted him with the formal throat clicks that indicated professional displeasure. I have come to assess the situation you have created here. The Council is concerned about reports of your offspring displaying non-standard behaviors. They're not displaying behaviors, Vexhai, Zixthara replied calmly. They're demonstrating abilities. There's a significant difference. They stood at the entrance to the hydroponics bay, where Emma was teaching a small group of human children how to communicate with Kira and Nyx through a combination of gestures, musical tones, and something that could only be described as emotional projection. The success rate was remarkable. Within hours, human children could establish basic communication with the transformed hatchlings. This is precisely what concerns us, Vexhai said, his skin taking on the grayish tint that indicated deep disapproval. You're allowing an alien species to influence the development of Velthari young. The genetic contamination could be irreversible. There is no genetic contamination, Sarah interjected, approaching with a data pad full of test results. Dr. Vexhai, I presume. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, xenobiologist. I've been monitoring your offspring's development closely, Commander Zixthara, and I can assure you that their DNA remains purely Velthari. What we're seeing is the expression of dormant genetic potential that has always existed in your species. Vexhai's scientific training warred with his cultural conditioning. Dormant potential? That's impossible. We have mapped the complete Velthari genome. There are no unknown genetic sequences that could account for these alleged abilities. You mapped the genome that you expected to see, Sarah corrected gently, but you filtered out the sequences associated with albinism because you classified them as defective. What if they're not defects at all? What if they're evolutionary adaptations that only activate under specific environmental and social conditions? Emma appeared at Sarah's side, having finished her impromptu lesson with the other children. She looked up at the imposing Velthari scientist with the fearless curiosity that seemed to be a universal human trait. Are you Kira and Nyx's uncle? She asked brightly. They've been wanting to meet more of their family. Vexhai looked down at the small human with obvious bewilderment. Child, I am not related to these specimens. I am here to study their anomalous development. Specimens? Emma's eyebrows drew together in the way that made adults realize they had said something wrong. They're not specimens. They're people, and they have names. Before Vexhai could respond, Kira and Nyx emerged from the deeper sections of the bay, moving with that flowing grace that had become their signature. They approached the scientist without fear, their opalescent scales catching the light in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. The moment they came within a few meters of Vexhai, something extraordinary happened. The scientist's throat sacs began to pulse in rhythm with the hatchling's breathing, and his skin took on a faint luminescence that mirrored their own. For the first time in his life, Vexhai was experiencing the empathic connection that the transformed offspring could create. What is this? He whispered, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. They're sharing their perspective with you, Emma explained matter-of-factly. It doesn't hurt. It's actually really nice once you get used to it. Through the connection, Vexhai experienced what Zixthera had felt days earlier, a fundamental shift in how he perceived the galaxy around him. He could sense the life forces of every being in the bay, from the smallest bacterial cultures to the complex emotional patterns of the humans present. But more than that, he could feel the deep loneliness that had characterized his entire adult life, a loneliness he had never admitted even to himself. "I've been studying life for 40 years, he said quietly, but I've never actually felt it before. The connection lasted only a few minutes before the hatchlings gently withdrew, but the impact on Vexhai was immediate and profound. He stared at them with new eyes, seeing not genetic aberrations but evolutionary pioneers. "How many?" he asked Zixthera urgently. "How many albino offspring have we lost over the centuries because we couldn't see what they really were?" "Too many," Zixthera replied sadly. "But we can change that now. Emma and her people have shown us how." Sarah pulled up a holographic display showing genetic analysis data. "Dr. Vexhai, we've identified similar dormant sequences in 17 other species. The potential for this kind of transformation exists throughout the galaxy, but it requires very specific conditions to activate." "What kind of conditions?" Vexhai asked, his scientific mind racing with possibilities. "Acceptance," Emma said simply. "Love. And people who don't try to fix what's different about you." Thorn had been observing from a respectful distance, but now he approached with information that would change everything. "Commander Dr. Chen, we've received communications from 7 different worlds. Word has spread about what's happening here, and they're reporting similar phenomena among their own defective populations." "What kind of phenomena?" Sarah asked. "Spontaneous ability manifestations, enhanced communication skills, unprecedented problem-solving capabilities." Thorn's expression was grave, and in every case it's happening to individuals who were previously considered genetic failures or social outcasts. Vexhai sat down heavily, the weight of realization settling over him. "We've been culling our own evolutionary advantage for millennia. The traits we've been eliminating as defects were actually the key to our next stage of development." "Not culling," Emma corrected with the gentle firmness that made her such an effective teacher, "just not understanding. But now we do understand, so we can do better." "How?" Vexhai asked. "How do we undo centuries of discrimination and ignorance?" Sarah smiled, and in that expression was all the determination and optimism that had made humanity such an unexpected force for positive change in the galaxy. "We start with the children. We create more gardens like this one, and we teach every species that what makes someone different might just be what makes them extraordinary." As if in response to her words, Kira and Nyx began to sing, not the simple chittering of traditional Velthari communication, but a complex harmony that seemed to resonate with the very structure of the station around them. Other beings throughout the bay joined in, each contributing their own species' unique vocal patterns to create something that had never existed before. A truly universal song. "They're composing a message," Vexhai breathed, his enhanced perception allowing him to understand what was happening. "They're creating a communication that can be understood by any sentient species." "What are they saying?" Zixthera asked. Emma listened intently, her young mind somehow able to process the multidimensional message being created. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of profound truth. "They're saying we are here. We are different. We are ready to help. Will you let us?" The song continued for nearly an hour, and by the time it ended, similar harmonies were being reported from stations and colonies across the galaxy. The age of the outcasts had begun, and it was the humans who had shown them the way. Over the following days, Zixthera found himself spending more time in the hydroponics bay than in his official quarters. Sarah had managed to convince the station administrators that this was an important scientific discovery that required careful observation and documentation. What she didn't tell them was how profoundly the experience was changing everyone involved. Emma had become the unofficial translator between the hatchlings and the adult world. Her ability to understand their evolving communication was unprecedented in galactic history. No species had ever successfully learned to fully communicate with another in such a fundamental way, especially not a human child with alien beings that her own species had only recently encountered. "They're trying to show you something," Emma explained to her mother as they watched Kira and Nyx move through an elaborate dance-like sequence among the plants. Their white scales had developed an almost liquid quality, shifting between translucent and opaque as they moved. It's about how things grow when they're not forced to be what everyone expects them to be. Sarah was documenting everything with scientific precision, but even her trained mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. Emma, what exactly are they becoming? This goes beyond normal Velthari development patterns. They're becoming themselves, Emma said with the simple clarity that made adult conversations seem unnecessarily complicated. Before they were trying to be like other Velthari because that's what everyone wanted. But they're not other Velthari. They're something new. Zixthara watched his offspring with a mixture of pride and fear. In traditional Velthari society, such radical deviation from accepted norms would be seen as dangerous, possibly even grounds for exile. But here, surrounded by humans and their extraordinary capacity for acceptance, his children were blossoming into something magnificent. The changes weren't just physical. Kira and Nyx had begun to demonstrate abilities that no Velthari had ever possessed. They could sense the health and needs of the plants around them, somehow knowing exactly how much water or light each species required. They moved with a grace that seemed to bend the very air around them, and their chittering songs had evolved into complex harmonies that made the entire bay feel more alive. Commander. Thorn approached hesitantly, his usual gruff demeanor softened by days of witnessing the impossible. I've been thinking about what the little human said, about helping things grow instead of making them fit into predetermined shapes. What about it, Chief? Thorn's forearms gestured toward the thriving plants around them. I've been in security for 40 standard years. I've seen every species in the galaxy try to impose their idea of order on others. But humans, they do something different. They see potential where others see problems. The hatchlings would have died on a Velthari world, Zixthara admitted quietly. Not from their condition, but from the treatment they would have received. Our society has no place for those who are different. And yet here they are, becoming something that might be more advanced than any of us, Thorn observed. Makes me wonder what other defective individuals might achieve if given the right environment. Emma had been listening to their conversation while continuing to interact with the hatchlings. Now she looked up with that serious expression that children sometimes wore when they understood something that adults had missed. They want to show you something special, she announced, but you have to promise not to be scared. What kind of special? Sarah asked, her maternal instincts clearly warring with her scientific curiosity. The kind that proves humans are really good at making friends, Emma replied. Kira and Nyx approached their father, moving with that fluid grace that had become their signature. They pressed their foreheads against his hands, and suddenly Zixithara's mind was flooded with images and sensations that took his breath away. He saw the galaxy as his offspring now perceived it, not as separate species competing for resources and territory, but as an intricate web of interconnected life forms, each with unique gifts that could benefit all others. He felt their deep gratitude toward Emma, not just for her friendship, but for showing them that being different was a strength rather than a weakness. Most remarkably, he experienced their vision of the future. They saw themselves not as outcasts from Velthari society, but as bridges between species. Their enhanced empathic abilities and unique communication skills could help forge connections that had never been possible before. They want to help, Zixthara whispered, tears flowing down his pale cheeks. They don't see themselves as victims or as superior beings. They see themselves as helpers. Sarah was recording everything, but her hands were shaking with excitement. Commander, do you understand what this means? We're witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of intelligence. Not just individual evolution, but cooperative evolution between species. It means Emma was right, Zixthara said, looking at the small human girl who had somehow understood his children better than he had. Humans are extraordinary at nurturing potential. You don't try to change what's different. You help it become what it was meant to be. Emma beamed with pride, but then her expression grew thoughtful. There's something else they want to tell you, Mr. Zixithara, about other babies like them. Other albino Velthari? Zixthara's throat sacs inflated with sudden understanding. You mean there are others who could undergo this transformation? The hatchlings chittered excitedly and Emma nodded. Not just Velthari. They think there are special babies in lots of different species who get treated badly because they're different. But if they had places like this to grow and friends who understood them, the implications hit everyone simultaneously. They weren't just witnessing the transformation of two individual beings. They were potentially looking at a new model for galactic society, one where differences were celebrated and nurtured rather than suppressed. Thorn was the first to speak. "We're going to need a bigger hydroponics bay." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and full of possibility. "We're going to need a lot of things, starting with a way to convince other species that what they've been calling defects might actually be the key to our collective future." "Leave that to us," Emma said confidently. "Humans are really good at convincing people to try new things, especially when those new things involve helping kids." As the day cycle faded into artificial night, Zixathera sat with his transformed offspring and their human friend, watching the plants around them pulse gently with bioluminescent rhythms that seemed to match the hatchlings' peaceful breathing. For the first time since his mate's death, he felt hope for the future. His children hadn't just survived their differences, they had transformed them into gifts that could change the galaxy. And it had all started with a human child who saw potential where others saw problems, and who had the courage to help that potential grow. The chittering sound led them through winding corridors that most station personnel rarely visited. Sarah had insisted on leading the search party, claiming she had experience with wayward younglings, though she was cryptic about what exactly that meant. Zixathera followed closely behind, his anxiety mounting with each step deeper into the station's lower levels. Thorn brought up the rear, his bulk barely fitting through some of the narrower passages. His security team had wanted to accompany them, but Sarah had convinced him that a smaller group would be less threatening if the hatchlings were indeed hiding voluntarily. "The atmospheric readings are getting stronger," Sarah reported, checking her portable scanner. "Whatever's down here, it's been breathing and moving around for several days at least." The corridor opened into a vast hydroponics bay that Zixathera had never seen before. Rows upon rows of earth plants grew under specialized lighting, creating a jungle-like environment that felt alien yet somehow comforting. The air was thick with moisture and the rich scent of growing things. "I didn't know humans had established agricultural facilities this extensive," Zixathera murmured, his voice filled with wonder. The plants seemed to respond to their presence, leaves rustling despite the absence of any breeze. "This is actually a joint project," Sarah explained, her tone proud but modest. "We're working with 17 different species to create sustainable food sources that can support multiple biological needs. It's one of humanity's contributions to galactic cooperation, the ability to nurture life rather than just study it." The chittering sound grew louder, more complex. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the green maze of plants. Zixathera's throat sacs pulsed with recognition. This was definitely his offspring, but their sounds had evolved, become more sophisticated than he'd ever heard from Velthari young. "This way," Sarah said confidently, following a path that seemed to wind deeper into the artificial forest. "I'm starting to understand something about your hatchlings, Commander. I don't think they're lost or scared. I think they're growing." They pushed through a curtain of hanging vines and emerged into a clearing where the impossible waited for them. A small human child, perhaps 8 or 9 Earth years old, sat cross-legged on the soft ground. She had auburn hair that caught the filtered light, and her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and mischief. She was humming softly, and 2 small white shapes were curled up against her, fast asleep. Zixathera's heart nearly stopped. His hatchlings looked different, healthier somehow, their white scales gleaming with a pearl-like luminescence he'd never seen before. They were larger than when he'd last seen them, and their breathing was deep and peaceful. "Daddy," the little girl whispered excitedly, then caught herself and spoke more quietly. "I mean, you must be their daddy. They've been telling me all about you." "Emma Chen," Sarah said with a mixture of exasperation and pride. "I should have known. Commander Zixathera, meet my daughter." "Emma, what have you been doing?" The child, Emma, looked completely unashamed as she gently stroked one of the sleeping hatchlings. "They were sad, Mommy. They kept coming to the viewing ports near our quarters and making those pretty sounds, but nobody understood them. So I followed them one day and they led me here." "You've been missing for 3 days, young lady," Sarah said sternly, though her relief was obvious. "Do you have any idea how worried everyone's been?" "I left notes," Emma protested. "I told you I was helping some friends. Besides, they needed me. They were trying to tell everyone something important, but Grown-ups don't listen very well. Zixathera approached slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might wake his offspring. What were they trying to say? Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm. Oh, so many things. They're not sick or wrong like some people think. They're just different, like flowers that bloom at night instead of during the day. They needed somewhere dark and warm and wet, like where they would have hatched if they'd been born on their homeworld. But Velthari hatchlings are raised in climate-controlled nurseries, Zixthara said, confused. We've perfected the environmental conditions for optimal development. For normal Velthari, maybe, Emma said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that only children possessed. But Kira and Nyx aren't normal, and that's what makes them special. They remember things in their genetic memory that got forgotten. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, her scientific mind clearly racing. Emma, how do you know their names? How do you know any of this? They told me, Emma said simply. Not with words, but with their sounds and movements. It's like music, but it means things. They've been trying to teach their daddy for months, but he was too worried about making them fit in to understand what they really needed. Thorn, who had been silent throughout this exchange, spoke up quietly. The child has been living down here for 3 days? How did she survive? What did she eat? Emma giggled. The plants here make fruit that's safe for lots of different species, and Kira and Nyx are really good at finding water sources. Plus, I brought some ration packs from Mommy's lab. You stole food from my laboratory? Sarah asked. Borrowed, Emma corrected. I was going to put it back when we were done helping them get ready. Ready for what? Zixathera asked, his voice trembling with emotions he couldn't name. For the change, Emma said, her voice dropping to an awed whisper. They're not just hatchlings anymore, Mr. Zixathera. They're becoming something new. Something that's never existed before. As if summoned by her words, both hatchlings stirred and opened their eyes. Instead of the usual pale blue of young Velthari, their eyes had developed intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid starlight. They looked up at their father and chittered softly, and for the first time in his life, Zixathara found that he could understand them. They weren't speaking in the traditional Velthari language of clicks and throat sounds. They were communicating in something far more complex, a mixture of emotion, image, and pure meaning that bypassed language entirely. And somehow this small human child had learned to understand it perfectly. Hello, Father, they seemed to say without words. We have been preparing. We have been learning. We have been waiting for you to find us so we could show you what we have become. Zixathera sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the realization that his children had not been taken or lost. They had been growing beyond anything he had thought possible. Guided by the instinctive wisdom of a human child who saw their potential instead of their differences. How? He whispered. Emma smiled and patted his arm comfortingly. Humans are really good at helping things grow, Mr. Zixathera. It's what we do best. Commander Zixathera pressed his 6-fingered hands against the cool metal of the observation deck. His pale blue skin almost translucent under the artificial lighting of the research station. His kind, the Velthari, were known throughout the galaxy for their methodical nature and scientific precision. But today, his usual composure was shattered. His twin hatchlings, barely 3 cycles old, had vanished without a trace. The research station orbited a small planet called Earth, where various alien species conducted peaceful studies alongside the curious bipedal creatures known as humans. Zixathera had been assigned here for 2 standard years, studying human behavioral patterns and their remarkable adaptability. What he hadn't expected was to become a single parent when his mate died in a transport accident 6 months ago. His hatchlings, Kira and Nyx, were unlike other Velthari young. Born with a rare genetic condition that left their scales completely white instead of the traditional blue-gray, they were considered outcasts by their own species. Their albino appearance made them sensitive to bright lights and caused other Velthari to avoid them, believing them to be cursed. Zixathera loved them fiercely, but he struggled to understand their needs. The station's security chief, a hulking Chromax named Thorn, approached with heavy footsteps that echoed through the corridor. His forearms gestured dismissively as he spoke in his gravelly voice. Commander, we've searched every section 3 times. Your offspring are not aboard this station. Perhaps they've found a way to the transport bays. Zixathera's throat sacs inflated with distress, a sign of extreme anxiety among his people. They're just hatchlings, Chief Thorn. They can barely navigate their own quarters, let alone access restricted areas. Someone must have taken them. Who would want to steal two albino Velthari younglings? Thorn's massive head tilted, his small eyes blinking slowly. No offense, Commander, but your species isn't exactly known for being valuable in illegal markets. The word stung, but Zixthera knew Thorn meant no harm. The Chromax were brutally honest by nature. Still, the comment highlighted what Zixthara feared most, that his children were seen as worthless by most of the galaxy. Unwanted even by their own kind, Dr. Sarah Chen, the human xenobiologist assigned to the station, approached them with her characteristic quick, determined stride. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her brown eyes showed genuine concern. Humans, Zixthara had learned, were remarkably empathetic creatures, often showing more compassion than species that claimed to be more evolved. Any sign of them? Sarah asked, her voice gentle but urgent. She had been one of the few beings on the station who treated Kira and Nyx with kindness, often bringing them small gifts and speaking to them in soft tones that seemed to calm their usually anxious demeanor. Nothing, Zixthara replied, his voice cracking with emotion. They disappeared from the childcare center during rest period. The automated systems show no record of them leaving the area, but they're simply gone. Sarah frowned, her mind clearly working through possibilities. Have you checked the maintenance shafts? Human children sometimes hide in small spaces when they're scared or upset. Maybe Velthari hatchlings do the same? Thorn snorted. Those passages are too narrow for proper life forms. Only maintenance drones use them. Or very small beings, Sarah countered. Commander, when did you last see them behaving normally? Any changes in their routine or mood? Zixthara considered the question carefully. The Velthari prided themselves on observation and detail. 3 days ago, they seemed restless during sleep cycle. They kept making soft chittering sounds, which usually indicates they're trying to communicate something important, but I couldn't understand what they needed. Chittering. Sarah's eyebrows rose with interest. That's not mentioned in any of the Velthari behavioral studies I've read. Because it's associated with the albino condition, Zixthara admitted reluctantly. Most of my people consider it a sign of mental deficiency. The hatchlings are often euthanized before they can develop such behaviors. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sarah's face paled, and even Thorn's usually impassive expression showed a flicker of understanding. The galaxy was vast and filled with wonders, but it could also be cruel to those who were different. We'll find them, Sarah said firmly, placing a small, warm hand on Zixthara's arm. The gesture was surprisingly comforting. I have an idea about where they might be, but I'll need access to the station's environmental controls and life support data. Granted, Thorn said immediately. Anything you need, Doctor. As they made their way to the central command center, Zixthara found himself grateful for these unlikely allies. His own people had offered little help, suggesting that perhaps it was natural selection at work. The Chromax security forces were thorough but lacked imagination. Only the humans seemed to truly care about finding 2 lost albino hatchlings. The command center buzzed with activity as various species worked at their stations. Sarah quickly accessed the environmental systems, her fingers flying over the holographic interface with practiced ease. Humans, despite their relatively short lifespan, had an incredible capacity for learning and adapting to new technologies. Here, Sarah said, pointing to a series of readings on the main display. Look at these atmospheric compositions in sections 7G through 12G. Higher humidity, slightly lower temperature, and, interesting, elevated carbon dioxide levels in specific pockets. Breathing patterns, Zixthara realized, his hope rising for the first time in hours. You think they're hiding in the lower sections? I think they're trying to create an environment that feels safe to them, Sarah replied. The question is why those specific areas and why now? As if in response to her question, the station's communication system crackled to life. A soft, melodic chittering sound filled the air. The same sound Zixthara's hatchlings had been making for days. It was coming from somewhere deep within the station's bowels, but it wasn't random noise. There was a pattern to it, almost like a song. They're trying to tell us something, Sarah whispered, her eyes bright with discovery. Commander, I don't think your hatchlings are lost. I think they're exactly where they want to be.